Ethan Caldwell didn't just want his coffee hot. He wanted his revenge served at boiling point. He watched with a sneer of arrogant satisfaction as the steaming liquid erupted from the cup, a dark, jagged arc of malice aimed directly at the woman he once claimed to love. The scalding coffee splashed across Shayla's white uniform, the thin fabric offering no protection as it soaked through to sear the delicate skin beneath. Her scream, raw and shattered by shock, tore through the upscale restaurant like a jagged blade, freezing the movement of every server and silencing the hum of the wealthy elite in a heartbeat. She collapsed, her hands instinctively clutching her chest as the heat bloomed into agonizing blisters, her tears mingling with the bitter scent of roasted beans and betrayal. And Ethan laughed. He stood over her, his athletic frame leaning forward in a mockery of dominance, his mouth open in a wide, cruel bark of amusement. His tailored black suit remained pristine, a sharp contrast to the ruined woman at his feet whose only crime was surviving him. He didn't see her as a person. He saw her as an unfinished lesson, a footnote in his portfolio of power. "That's what happens when you forget your place, Shayla," he sneered, his voice loud enough to claim the entire silent room. "Maybe next time you'll think twice before serving someone who actually matters." He reached for his phone, ready to record her humiliation for his followers, certain that his wealth made him untouchable. But he didn't notice the shadow that had detached itself from the corner booth. He didn't see Min-Jae Park, the man whose neck tattoos whispered of a violence Ethan could only pretend to possess, stepping silently into the light behind him. Ethan Caldwell was about to learn that in this city, there are those who play at being monsters, and then there are the men who actually hunt them. Please like and subscribe as the story unfolds. The silence in the restaurant was heavy, a suffocating blanket of cowardice that Ethan Caldwell mistook for respect. He adjusted his silk tie, his laughter still echoing off the marble walls as Shayla huddled on the floor, the steam still rising from her ruined uniform. He felt like a god in a tailored suit, until a shadow fell over him that felt colder than the air conditioning. A hand, heavy and immovable as an iron shackle, clamped onto Ethan's shoulder. Ethan's smirk didn't just fade, it curdled. He tried to shrug the grip off, but the fingers tightened, digging into the trapezius muscle with anatomical precision. Before he could utter a word of protest, a sudden, violent downward force buckled his knees. The billionaire hit the polished floor with a bone-jarring thud, forced into a kneeling position directly in front of the woman he had just been mocking. Min-Jae Park didn't move with haste. He moved with the terrifying grace of a predator that had already won. He leaned down, his face inches from Ethan. Up close, the tattoos snaking up Min-Jae's neck dark, intricate symbols of a life forged in blood, were impossible to ignore. His eyes weren't filled with the hot rage Ethan was used to seeing. They were flat, dark, and utterly devoid of mercy. "You like the view from down there, Ethan." Min-Jae's voice was a low, melodic rasp that seemed to vibrate in Ethan's very marrow. "Do you know who I am?" Ethan hissed, though his voice lacked its usual bite as he struggled against the weight on his shoulder. "I'll have this place leveled. I'll have you." The pressure increased. Ethan let out a strangled gasp, his face flushing a deep, panicked red. Min-Jae didn't blink. He reached out his free hand and gently, almost tenderly, plucked the smartphone from Ethan's grasp. With a casual flick of his wrist, he dropped the expensive device into the remains of the scalding coffee pooling on the floor. "In my world," Min-Jae whispered, his tone conversational yet lethal, "we have a very simple code. We don't break things that are more valuable than us. And right now, this woman's dignity is worth more than your entire family's portfolio." Min-Jae glanced at Shayla. Her eyes were wide, brimming with tears of pain and shock, fixed on the man who had appeared like a dark ghost to defend her. Min-Jae's expression didn't soften, but the intensity of his gaze shifted, acknowledging her humanity in a way no one else in the room dared to. He turned his attention back to the trembling man on his knees. Min-Jae leaned in closer, his breath cold against Ethan's ear. "This is your only warning, little boy. You've spent your life thinking money is a shield. But out here, in the shadows where I live, money is just paper that burns. If you ever follow her, if you ever speak her name, if she so much as sheds a single tear because of you again." You won't just lose your status. You will bleed. And I promise you, I am very, very good at making it last. Min-Jae released him. Ethan collapsed forward, hands splashing into the wet mess on the floor, his aura of invincibility shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. Without a backward glance at the ruined man, Min-Jae reached down, offering a steady, tattooed hand to Shayla. "Stand up," he said, his voice finally carrying a hint of gruff warmth. "The floor is no place for you." The transition from the restaurant to the sleek, black interior of Min-Jae's SUV was a blur of adrenaline and throbbing pain for Shayla. She sat in the leather seat, her body trembling with a delayed shock that felt like ice in her veins, contrasting sharply with the fire still eating at the skin of her chest. Next to her, Min-Jae Park was a silent, imposing monolith. He didn't offer empty platitudes or tell her it would be okay. Instead, he made a single, brief call in Korean, his voice a low vibration of absolute command. "The burns are second degree," he said, his eyes finally shifting to her. He didn't look at her with the pity she had seen from the few patrons who had bothered to look up. He looked at her with the clinical, intense focus of a strategist assessing a wounded ally. "You will not be going to the city hospital. There is too much paperwork there, and too many people Ethan Caldwell can buy." Instead, the car pulled up to a private clinic in a quiet, high-walled district that Shayla hadn't known existed. Within seconds, she was whisked into a sterile, state-of-the-art suite where a team of specialists waited. They moved with a silent, fearful efficiency that told Shayla everything she needed to know about the man who had brought her here. Min-Jae stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the harsh fluorescent lights, his dark suit and the ink on his neck marking him as a creature of a different world. As a nurse applied a soothing, cooling dressing to her burns, Shayla winced, her breath catching in a sob she couldn't suppress. Min-Jae stepped forward, his presence instantly causing the medical staff to stiffen. He reached out, his large, calloused hand hovering near hers. He didn't take it, perhaps sensing he was still a stranger, or perhaps knowing his hands were stained with things she couldn't imagine, but the sheer weight of his proximity acted as an anchor. "They are giving you the best," he stated, his gaze fixed on the treatment. "Everything is paid for, the recovery, the time off, and the security outside this door." "Why?" Shayla whispered, her voice cracking. "You don't even know me. He's powerful. You shouldn't have gotten involved." Min-Jae's expression remained a mask of stone, but his eyes flashed with a cold inner light. "He thinks he is powerful because he can ruin a girl's afternoon. I have seen true power, Shayla. It doesn't scream and it doesn't throw coffee to feel tall." He leaned down slightly, his voice dropping to a protective rasp. "You were a casualty of his ego. In my territory, that is an insult I do not overlook. Sleep now. No one enters this room unless I allow it. Not the police, not your past, and certainly not him." For the first time in years, the crushing weight of fear that had followed her since the breakup began to lift. Min-Jae was terrifying, a man who clearly ruled by shadow and iron, yet as the sedative began to pull her under, Shayla felt a strange, paradoxical sense of peace. She was being guarded by a monster, but for the first time, the monster was on her side. The bruise on Ethan Caldwell's ego was far more painful than the physical ache in his knees. Safe within the tinted glass of his penthouse, the humiliation of the restaurant played on a loop in his mind, fueling a frantic, toxic desperation. He couldn't reach the man with the tattoos. Min-Jae was a ghost in the machinery of the city, but he knew exactly where to find Shayla. To Ethan, she was the root of his shame, and he was determined to pluck her from the earth. He didn't start with violence. He started with the weapons he understood, influence and paper. By Monday morning, Ethan was on the phone with the primary shareholders of the restaurant group. His voice was once again smooth, dripping with the practiced entitlement of the elite. He painted a picture of a disturbed waitress who had staged an accident to extort a high-profile client, claiming her associates had threatened him. "It's a liability issue," Ethan purred into the receiver, swirling a glass of amber scotch. "I'd hate to see the board's reputation tarnished because of one emotional girl. I'm sure you can find someone more professional." By noon, the pressure had trickled down. The restaurant manager, a man who had previously praised Shayla's work ethic, found himself staring at his shoes as he drafted a termination notice. The favors Ethan called in were like a slow-acting poison, moving through the professional circles of the district, ensuring that Shayla Brooks wouldn't just lose her job. She would be blacklisted from every high-end establishment in the city. But Ethan wasn't satisfied with a quiet firing. He wanted to see the light go out of her eyes. He spent the afternoon trailing the black SUV Min-Jae had provided, keeping a careful distance in a nondescript rental car. He watched from across the street as Shayla stepped out of the private clinic, her chest heavily bandaged under a loose shirt. She looked fragile, her movements slow and pained, but she was alive in a way that infuriated him. She was under someone else's protection, and to Ethan, that was a personal theft. He waited until the SUV pulled away, leaving two of Min-Jae's men stationed at the clinic entrance. From the shadows of his parked car, Ethan snapped photos, his thumb hovering over the send button to a private investigator he used for cleaning up his past mistakes. He began drafting a series of anonymous tips to the police and immigration services, weaving a web of lies about Shayla's family and her brother's legal status. He was so consumed by his digital crusade, so intoxicated by the feeling of regaining control, that he failed to notice the silence of the street around him. He didn't see the two black sedans that had pulled up silently behind his rental, boxing him into the curb. He didn't notice the flickering of the street lamp overhead as a heavy, rhythmic thumping began to vibrate through the pavement. Ethan was so focused on destroying Shayla's future that he had completely forgotten Min-Jae's warning. He believed the world still ran on phone calls and boardrooms. He didn't realize that while he was calling in favors, Min-Jae Park was calling in the debt. As a shadow blocked the moonlight streaming through his window, Ethan finally looked up, the smirk on his face freezing into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. The air inside Min-Jae's private office was thick with the scent of ozone and expensive tobacco, a sanctuary of high-tech surveillance tucked behind a wall of vintage whiskey. On the massive monitors lining the room, the digital life of Ethan Caldwell was being dissected with surgical precision. Min-Jae sat in a high-backed leather chair, his fingers steepled, his eyes reflecting the cold blue glow of scrolling data. Behind him, his lead analyst, a woman known only as Sora, tapped a final key, freezing a mosaic of faces and legal documents on the screen. "He's not just a bully, boss," Sora said, her voice devoid of emotion. "He's a predator with a subscription to silence." Min-Jae's gaze drifted over the files. It wasn't just about Shayla. As the Japak moved through the encrypted servers of the Caldwell family's private legal firm, a pattern emerged, a dark, rhythmic cycle of abuse followed by the heavy application of cash. There were 6 women before Shayla, 6 women who had been managed by the Caldwell estate. The documents were chilling in their clinical detachment. Each file contained a non-disclosure agreement, a photocopy of a wire transfer, and a series of character assessments designed to destroy the victims if they ever spoke out. Min-Jae watched as Sora pulled up a police report from 3 years prior, an assault charge involving a former intern that had vanished into thin air 48 hours after it was filed. The arresting officer had taken a voluntary retirement a month later, funded by a Caldwell-affiliated shell company. "His family doesn't just protect him," Min-Jae murmured, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "They cultivate him. They've built a world where he believes people are disposable assets." He stood up, walking toward the screens until he was inches from Ethan's smug, high-resolution portrait. The tattoos on Min-Jae's neck seemed to pulse in the flickering light. He saw these settlements, amounts that were meant to represent the value of a human spirit. 50,000 for a broken rib, 100,000 for a career destroyed. To the Caldwells, it was just the cost of doing business. To Min-Jae, it was an admission of a rot that went all the way to the foundation. "He's calling the restaurant board now," Sora reported, her hands flying across her keyboard. "He's trying to blacklist her. He's already sent 3 anonymous tips to the licensing bureau about the restaurant's kitchen standards. He's trying to starve her out." Min-Jae didn't flinch. A slow, predatory smile touched his lips, the kind of smile that preceded a landslide. "He thinks he's playing a game of influence. He thinks he's moving pieces on a board." Min-Jae turned away from the screen, his shadow stretching long across the floor. "He doesn't realize that I've already burned the board. If he wants to use his history to bury her, we will use his history to bury him, deep enough that the Caldwell name never sees the light of day again. What's the move, boss? Pull the threads, Min-Jae commanded. Every woman he silenced, every cop he bought, every life he thought he owned. We don't just protect Shayla. We give her an army of ghosts to lead the charge. The narrow, dimly lit hallway of Shayla's apartment building smelled of floor wax and old brick, a world away from the sterile luxury of the Caldwell penthouse. Ethan's hired cleaners, 3 men with dead eyes and heavy jackets, moved with the practiced silence of professional intimidation. They didn't care about the girl. They only cared about the envelope of cash Ethan had promised for sending a message. The tallest one, a man with a jagged scar across his knuckles, pulled a set of lockpicks from his pocket, his movements efficient as he worked the tumbler to Shayla's front door. With a faint click, the door swung open into a void of absolute darkness. The thugs stepped inside, their boots treading softly on the worn carpet. They expected to find a terrified woman huddled in bed. Instead, the heavy scent of expensive sandalwood and cold iron met them. The door behind them didn't just close. It was shut with a firm, deliberate finality. A small, orange ember glowed in the corner of the living room, the only light in the suffocating blackness. As the ember brightened, the silhouette of a man sitting in an armchair became visible. Min-Jae Park took a slow drag from his cigarette, the smoke curling around his head like a spectral crown. He didn't stand. He didn't reach for a weapon. He simply watched them, his eyes reflecting the tiny spark of fire with a terrifying, predatory stillness. "You're late," Min-Jae said, his voice a low, melodic rasp that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. Ethan usually expects faster results for his money. The man with the scarred knuckles reached for the 9 tucked into his waistband, but he never cleared leather. From the shadows behind the sofa, 2 of Min-Jae's silent enforcers appeared like wraiths. One caught the thug's wrist in a grip that shattered bone, while the other drove a knee into the second man's solar plexus, folding him like paper. The third man froze, his hands trembling as he stared into the dark. Min-Jae stood up, his tall frame cutting a jagged line against the faint moonlight filtering through the blinds. He stepped into the center of the room, the ink on his neck seeming to writhe as he moved. He ignored the 2 groaning men on the floor, focusing his entire, crushing intensity on the one who remained standing. "Tell Ethan that the rules have changed," Min-Jae whispered, leaning in until his face was inches from the man's. "Tell him that Shayla's home is no longer a target. It is a graveyard for anyone who dares to cross the threshold." Min-Jae reached out, plucking a burner phone from the thug's jacket pocket. He dialed a number from memory and held it up. On the second ring, Ethan's voice came through, frantic and high-pitched. "Is it done? Did you get her?" Min-Jae didn't say a word. He simply crushed the phone in his bare hand, the plastic snapping and the screen splintering into 1,000 dead pixels. He dropped the ruins at the thug's feet. "Get them out of here," Min-Jae commanded his men, his voice turning cold as ice. "And leave the one with the broken wrist as a reminder. Ethan needs to see what happens when he sends children to do a man's work." As the apartment was cleared of the filth, Min-Jae walked to the window, looking out at the city he ruled. He knew the war wasn't over, but as he adjusted his cuffs, his expression was one of grim satisfaction. The hunt had officially begun. Min-Jae didn't believe in eye for an eye. He believed in the total removal of a person's foundation until they were left standing on nothing but air. While Ethan slept in his high-rise fortress, recovering from the terror of the failed night visit, Min-Jae sat in his darkened office and began the clean-out. It was a silent, digital execution. He didn't need guns for this stage. He needed the leverage he had spent a decade cultivating, the secrets of the powerful and the debts of the influential. The first strike hit Ethan's professional life at dawn. By 9:00 a.m., the board of directors at Caldwell's investment firm received an anonymous data dump. It wasn't just the history of settlements and NDAs. It was a forensic trail of Ethan's embezzlement from the company's discretionary fund to pay off his various victims. Before Ethan could even finish his first cup of coffee, his keycard was deactivated. His company-issued laptop was remotely wiped, and a security detail, ironically hired from a firm that owed Min-Jae a significant favor, was waiting at the lobby to escort him out without his briefcase. "You can't do this," Ethan screamed, his voice cracking as he stood on the sidewalk, a cardboard box of personal items in his arms. "Do you know who my father is?" But the name Caldwell was already becoming toxic. Min-Jae's reach extended into the social stratosphere where Ethan lived. By noon, Ethan received a formal letter of eviction from his penthouse. The building's management, suddenly concerned about moral turpitude clauses in the lease, had given him 48 hours to vacate. Simultaneously, the city's most exclusive clubs, places where Ethan had spent thousands to maintain his status, issued summary cancellations of his memberships. His name was flagged in the digital registries of every high-end restaurant and lounge from the financial district to the harbor. Min-Jae watched the progress from a tablet while sitting in the quiet of the clinic, where Shayla was finally getting some much-needed rest. He felt no joy in the destruction, only the cold satisfaction of a debt being balanced. He watched a video feed of Ethan being turned away from his favorite gym, the receptionist not even looking up as she told him his account had been permanently suspended for violations of conduct. Ethan was discovering the terrifying reality of the modern world. Your existence is only as real as the digital permissions granted to you. Min-Jae had revoked those permissions. The billionaire's son was being erased, one luxury at a time. His credit cards began to decline. His friends stopped answering his calls, sensing the scent of a sinking ship. By sunset, Ethan Caldwell was a ghost in a city that had worshipped him only 24 hours prior. Min-Jae set the tablet down and looked at Shayla, whose breathing was finally steady and deep. She didn't know yet that the man who had burned her was currently wandering the streets, realizing for the first time that his money couldn't buy him a seat at a table, let alone a way out of the storm Min-Jae had summoned. The clean-out was almost complete. Now only the final, personal reckoning remained. The city felt colder to Ethan Caldwell than it ever had before. His designer suit was rumpled, his pockets were empty of the plastic cards that usually commanded the world to bow, and his phone, the one lifeline he had left, was silent. He was a man stripped of his skin, exposed to the abrasive reality of a world that no longer recognized his name. Driven by a mixture of delusional entitlement and cornered animal rage, Ethan tracked the only person who seemed to still exist in his hollowed-out universe, Min-Jae Park. He found him exactly where it had all begun. The upscale restaurant was closed for a private event, the lights dimmed to a low, amber glow. Ethan bypassed the confused hostess at the entrance, his desperation lending him a frantic, jagged energy. He stormed into the dining room, his eyes scanning the tables until they landed on the corner booth. Min-Jae sat alone, a glass of dark tea in front of him. He didn't look up as Ethan approached, his presence so still it seemed to pull the very air from the room. "You think you've won?" Ethan screamed, his voice cracking as he slammed his hands onto the white linen tablecloth. "You think you can just delete me? My father has lawyers who will bury you in paperwork for the next 50 years. I'll have your people deported. I'll buy this entire block and turn it into a parking lot just to watch you starve." Min-Jae slowly raised his head. His dark eyes were like deep water, silent, heavy, and crushing. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't even stand. He simply studied Ethan's trembling form with the detached curiosity of a scientist looking at a dying specimen. "Your father called me an hour ago, Ethan," Min-Jae said, his voice a low, melodic rasp that cut through Ethan's hysterics like a scalpel. "He offered me $5 million to make this go away, to keep your name out of the depositions we've prepared." Ethan's face lit up with a sickly, triumphant glow. "See, I told you, everything has a price. Take the money and get out of my city." Min-Jae leaned forward, the light catching the sharp ink on his neck. "I told him it wasn't enough. Not because I wanted more, but because there isn't enough currency in the global market to pay for the scream I heard from that woman 3 days ago." Min-Jae stood up then, his tall, broad frame casting a shadow that seemed to swallow Ethan whole. "You still don't understand, do you? You aren't being bullied, Ethan. You are being held accountable. And for a man like you, that is the ultimate death sentence." Ethan stepped back, his bravado finally dissolving into raw terror. He realized then that he wasn't looking at a rival businessman or a common criminal. He was looking at a force of nature, a man who couldn't be bribed because he already owned what mattered, and who couldn't be bullied because he had nothing left to lose. "Please," Ethan whispered, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "I'll give her whatever she wants. I'll apologize, just make it stop." Min-Jae adjusted his cufflink, his expression as cold as a winter morning. "You aren't apologizing to her because you're sorry. You're apologizing because you're afraid, and fear is not redemption." Min-Jae signaled to the shadows, and 2 of his men appeared, blocking the exit. "The time for talking is over. Now, you're going to sit down, and you're going to sign the confessions we've prepared. Or you can walk out that door and see how long a ghost lasts in a city that's forgotten how to see him." Ethan looked at the pen on the table, then back at the dark, immovable man before him. For the first time in his life, the billionaire's son understood that some fires cannot be put out with money. They have to be endured. The morning sun spilled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the restaurant, casting long, golden rectangles across the polished hardwood. The space was eerily quiet, stripped of the frantic energy and the looming dread that had defined Shayla's life for so long. She stood in the center of the dining room, her hands resting lightly over the bandages on her chest. The physical pain was fading, replaced by a hollow, uncertain stillness. She was officially unemployed, her reputation in the district supposedly blackened by Ethan's lies, and her bank account was a desert. The heavy front door pushed open, and Min-Jae Park stepped inside. He wasn't wearing his usual dark overcoat, just a fitted charcoal suit that made the ink on his neck stand out like a warning label. He didn't say a word as he approached her, his footsteps echoing with a rhythmic, grounded authority. In his hand, he carried a simple manila folder. "How is the healing?" he asked, his voice low and steady. It was the first time he had spoken to her since the confrontation with Ethan. "The doctors say the scarring will be minimal," Shayla replied, her voice barely a whisper. She looked around the empty room. "I came to get the rest of my things. The manager sent me a formal termination notice last night. Ethan won, didn't he? Even after everything you did, I'm still the one standing in the street." Min-Jae didn't answer immediately. He walked to the bar, laying the folder down on the marble surface. "Ethan Caldwell didn't win. Ethan Caldwell no longer exists in any capacity that matters. His family has cut him off to save their own remaining assets, and by noon today, he will be processed into a remand center for the evidence he was forced to sign." He flipped the folder open and slid a single, heavy sheet of parchment toward her. It was embossed with a legal seal, but it wasn't a termination notice. Shayla's eyes scanned the fine print, her breath hitching as she hit the bolded lines near the center. It was a deed of transfer, a total change of corporate ownership. "The board was eager to sell," Min-Jae said, his expression unreadable. "Once they realized the alternative was a series of high-profile lawsuits and a complete audit of their investors' favors. I bought their shares, all of them." Shayla shook her head, confused. "So, you're my new boss. You want me to keep waitressing for you." "Look at the last page, Shayla." She turned the paper over. There, in the space designated for the principal owner, her own name was printed in clear, uncompromising ink. Beneath it was Min-Jae's signature as the facilitator, but the equity, 100% of it belonged to her. "I don't understand," she stammered, looking up at him. "This place, it's worth millions. Why would you give this to me?" Min-Jae stepped closer, his presence a towering wall of shadow and protection. "Because the person who tried to break you thought he could put a price on your life. This isn't a gift, Shayla. It's the balance being restored. You were the victim of this building's silence. Now you are its voice." He gestured to the empty room. "Hire who you want. Run it how you see fit. From this moment on, no one walks through that door and makes you feel small again." Shayla looked back at the deed, the reality of the moment finally crashing over her. The man who the world feared had handed her the keys to her own kingdom. She wasn't just safe, she was powerful. "What do I do now?" she asked, a tear finally escaping and tracing a path down her cheek. "Whatever you want," Min-Jae replied, turning toward the door. "That's what freedom feels like." The transition from the old regime to the new was marked by the removal of the heavy, gilded sign that had once bore a name synonymous with exclusion. In its place hung an understated slab of reclaimed slate, etched with a single word: sanctuary. The interior no longer smelled of sterile entitlement and expensive desperation. It smelled of fresh herbs, roasted garlic, and the genuine warmth of a kitchen run by someone who knew the value of every hand that prepared the food. On the night of the grand reopening, the atmosphere was electric but grounded. The staff, many of whom Shayla had personally recruited from the city's overlooked corners, moved with a pride that didn't require a script. There were no hushed tones of fear, no eyes downcast in the presence of wealth. Shayla stood at the pass, her movements fluid and confident. The bandages were gone, leaving behind a faint, silvery trace of a scar on her chest, a map of where she had been, and a reminder of the fire that hadn't been able to consume her. She looked out over the crowded dining room, her heart swelling as she saw families, students, and workers sitting alongside the district's elite. The invisible barriers that Ethan Caldwell had spent his life fortifying had been dismantled, replaced by a menu that welcomed everyone and a culture that protected the vulnerable. In the far corner, tucked into the same shadows where the story had begun, sat Min-Jae Park. He was dressed in a sharp, midnight blue suit, his presence as quiet and immovable as the foundation of the building itself. He didn't have a menu. He didn't need one. A single cup of dark tea sat before him, the steam curling upward to meet the ink on his neck. He wasn't participating in the celebration, but his eyes never stopped moving, scanning the room with the rhythmic, protective instinct of a predator ensuring his territory was at peace. Shayla walked over to his table, a small plate of her signature appetizer in hand. She set it down without a word, her eyes meeting his. For a moment, the noise of the restaurant faded. In the reflection of his dark pupils, she didn't see a victim, and she didn't even see a proprietor. She saw a woman who was finally, irrevocably free. "The seasoning is different," Min-Jae remarked, his voice a low, melodic rasp that carried a hint of a smile, the first she had ever truly seen. "It's my mother's recipe," Shayla replied, leaning against the edge of the booth. "I thought it was time this place had a bit of soul." Min-Jae took a slow sip of his tea, his gaze shifting toward the front door as a group of boisterous patrons entered. He didn't need to stand up or show a weapon. The mere weight of his existence in that corner acted as a silent guarantee that the peace of sanctuary would never be breached. He was the ghost in the machine, the quiet watcher who had stepped out of the darkness once to change her life, and who now remained in the shadows to ensure no one ever forced her back into them. "It suits you," Min-Jae said, nodding toward the room. "The life you've built." Shayla smiled, a genuine, radiant expression that reached her eyes. "We built it, Min-Jae." He didn't correct her. He simply watched as she turned back to her kitchen, her head held high, leading her team into a future that was no longer dictated by the whims of broken men. Min-Jae stayed until the last light was dimmed, a silent guardian in the dark, watching over the sanctuary he had helped forge from the ashes of a billionaire's arrogance. The balance was restored, and for the first time in a very long time, the city felt like it finally belonged to the people who kept it alive.